Well, hello, I'm Ted Gardner, and I'm an interviewer with the Public Library of Cincinnati and Hamilton County, and we're here to talk to Captain Ken Glass, retired Navy pilot from the USS Hornet. And Dennis Daly is our camera operator, and Ken, we'll get into it right away because I know you have a wonderful story and you have a lot to tell, and we want to get it all. Where were you born, Ken?
Well, Ted, I was born on a farm in the great state of Iowa.
Out there in the corn country.
Way back in 1922, believe it or not. In the days when we still had horses instead of tractors, and I milked cows by hand and
Isn't that something?
fed the chickens and the pigs and brought in the cows in the morning and all that good thing.
Did you have siblings, brothers and sisters?
I had three brothers. I had two older brothers and one younger brother.
Oh,
The younger brother also served in the Navy.
Isn't that something? Are they still with you?
No, I'm afraid not. I'm
Oh.
the last survivor of the family.
Well, we're very fortunate to have you here. Where did you go to elementary school?
The farm was about 3 miles from a little town called Dundee, Iowa. It was a consolidated district even in those days, with buses coming out to pick us up. And when I was a senior in high school, we had 54 in high school, grades 9 through 12.
How about that?
And my graduating class, there were 13 of us.
Isn't that something? Now, was that
Rather
Dundee?
small. It was a rather meager educational opportunity, Ted.
Well, I understand, and that, in those days too, Ken, it was shortly after World War I, and our nation was still trying to readjust a little bit
Yes.
to modern times and that sort of thing. So you grew up there. Did you go to high school in Dundee?
I did go to high
That
school
was a
in
Dundee
Dundee.
high school.
And
Okay. And
following Dundee, I was really not enamored with all the hard work on the farm, I must admit to you. So I went to a little college called Upper Iowa University in Fayette, Iowa, which was about 40 miles away from our farm.
I'll be darned.
Went there for a couple of years before I went to the Navy.
Okay, yeah. And you didn't ride a horse there, did you?
Did not ride a horse, but to help support myself in college, my parents obviously didn't have any kind of money like that. I had to work on the farm.
Sure.
Go from the farm to work on the farm to go to college.
Well, that's what you knew how to do. Yeah, that's really something.
Yeah, they had some farmland.
I should say, and you talk about not having much money. I was the same way. I grew up in a very small town, and tuition at a college in those days.
Practically nothing.
I know it.
Yeah.
It just blows people's minds away today to hear about it.
And I remember, like, the food bill was like $20 a week for all you could eat.
Isn't that something? Well, what did you aspire to when you went to college there, Upper Iowa?
I wanted to be a history professor, as a matter of fact.
Wonderful.
And I did study English history the 2 years that I attended college.
Okay.
And also during that entire period of time was when they first started providing this flight program for people that wanted to learn to fly with the possibility.
Civilian pilot training.
Yes, civilian pilot training, and my parents would never allow me to do that.
Yeah,
But I was determined that at some point I wanted to be a pilot.
absolutely. That was a wonderful program, and it just opened up
So many possibilities for
a new world to a
young
lot
men,
of people.
right.
Yeah. And those were the days of the barnstorming daredevil pilots flying the old rags and kites. And
I remember on the farm, maybe once a month I'd hear an airplane off in the distance.
yeah.
That's about as often as you would see one in those days.
Well, that's right. But when that happened, I can remember people stopping and looking up,
No,
It was just an amazing
that
thing.
was amazing.
Well, so at the end of 2 years of of college, then what happened?
Well, I had a younger brother that had graduated out of high school a year after I did, and being a fair-minded kind of a person that I am, Ted, I said to my brother Bruce, I said, why don't you go to Upper Iowa and I'll stay out for a year or two while you get a couple of years.
Oh, that's
Because my parents, they couldn't afford anything more,
course
so
not.
that's what happened. So,
right.
so the year the war started, I was actually back on the farm.
I'll be darned. Well, then, where were you on Pearl Harbor Day? Do you remember?
Pearl Harbor Day, I sure do. It was a cold day in December, obviously, and sitting in the house, we were listening to the radio, and all at once we heard this announcement of Pearl Harbor being bombed, and I immediately knew that I probably would be heading off to the military somewhere.
Sure. Yeah, and it was funny too, and you'll remember so well as I that so many people said, Pearl Harbor, where's that?
Yes.
Yeah, they didn't know about Pearl Harbor.
Heard of Hawaii, but not Pearl Harbor.
Exactly. And Hawaii was a territory then too, long before she
yes.
became a state. Well, so the first, you went down to the recruiting station or something?
I went down almost immediately. Even in December, I said to my parents, now I'm going to go and I'm going to try to be a flyer in one of the services. And I actually went to both the Army Air Force and the Navy. And I was sent to after a preliminary physical to see if my eyes were okay. I was sent to Minneapolis for further testing for both. I had to go 2 different times, once for the Army Air Force and once for the Navy.
For heaven's sake.
And as it turned out, the Navy decided to take me first. Thank heaven.
Yes, I should say.
So that's how I happened to be Navy and not Army Air Force.
Absolutely, nothing like naval aviation.
Right.
Well, that's very interesting. And here you were, farm boy with a couple of years of college, and you were traveling way up to Minneapolis a couple of times.
And I must admit to you that passing the mental part of the program was really not that easy for me, because I had the most minimum kind of education. No physics, no math, advanced math of any kind. And those tests, that's what they really came on with to see if you knew something about physics and that sort of thing.
Sure, because you had to learn about.
No problem with the physical at all.
No. Were you an athlete in those days?
I played baseball 4 years in high school and basketball 3 years.
That's great.
No, we didn't have football. We were too small.
Right.
Too small at school.
But there again, that's something that you were able to build a good part of your life on. Athletics was so important.
Absolutely.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah,
well then, okay, so here you were accepted by the Navy, and what did they say to you? Where are you going?
Well, they said, go on home and we'll be in touch with you. And
Right.
I did go back and let's see, this was, and in May I heard right away. They said report to what they call Wool Chamberlain Airport, which is Minneapolis Municipal now.
Oh, okay.
In Minneapolis.
Yeah.
So I arrived, I think it was around May 7th.
Right.
For my first go at the Navy. I'll tell you an interesting little story. We have time?
Oh, that's what it's all about, Ken. The more stories, the better.
Okay. Well, there was my roommate from Upper Iowa. I had also decided to join the Navy Air Corps, so we went together. And Bill Schupak was his name. He was a Swiss guy. And he kept saying, well, now we're supposed to be to Minneapolis, to the Naval Air Station there by 6 o'clock in the morning of the day we're to report in. And I said, oh, no, Bill. I said, we can get there anytime. So, and when I had gone up there earlier when they were trying to get me to sign up and everything, when we got, the streetcar ended about a half a mile from where the gate to the Naval Air Station was. And before, they had a transportation waiting for me there to take me back and forth to the end of the bus line to where I had to take the bus back home. Well, this time we got to the end of the line there about, I guess it was about 1 o'clock in the afternoon. So I called, I said, we're here waiting. And all I heard was a bunch of yelling over the phone, where you been? Get out here. I said, well, we're waiting for transportation. They said, you walk.
Welcome to the Navy.
That was my first mistake in the Navy. So we finally got there, I guess it was about 2 o'clock, and all the rest of the class, they were marching everywhere, and we had to hustle up and get our gear, our clothes, and before we could kind of join into the...
How about that? And that was interesting too, wasn't it? Being issued a different kind of garb, you know, and so forth, and fitting you for the right size and so forth, shoes.
I was always the small one in the group. I was the shortest. We had one guy that was, I think the Navy was only taking people who were 6'2" or 3" or something was the top limit.
Well,
so I was in a class of 26,
and
we were the last class that went straight to flight school.
Oh.
And every class after that had to go to pre-flight.
Pre-flight.
At Iowa City or somewhere.
Sure.
So we were the last one.
I'll be darned.
That's why I was able to get through the program so fast.
Right. Did you ever happen to come across Niall Kinnick there in Iowa?
I saw Niall Kenneth play football at the University of Iowa. I sure did.
Oh, I should say.
And that was so unfortunate when he lost his life.
Well, he was a great Navy, very great Navy guy. Well, okay, so here you are. You went direct to flight school. Where did they send you?
Minneapolis.
Oh, it was Minneapolis is where you got your primary.
We had 1 month of ground school.
Right.
Which again, that was not the easiest for me, getting through the math and the science part of it, but I did.
Right.
And you know, as I look back on it, I really didn't need all that we had to put up with. Like when I did dead reckoning navigation, that was mathematics, but it was very simple math.
That's right.
There was a little trigonometry involved with it because you're working with angles. And
That's
so
right.
But it wasn't that.
Well, I love that. I love that.
So anyway, we did a month. We were under the tutelage of a tough old gunny Marine sergeant.
Oh boy!
He put us through our paces, and we learned how to break down whatever the rifle was at that time. And did a lot of physical activity.
Out on the grinder.
Out on the grinder. But you mentioned earlier about that athletics and so on. I was always the kind of kid, being small, I wanted to be the best. So I loved physical education and trying to break the course records on the obstacle courses. Right.
Yeah, that naval training physical training was really something. For a lot of guys, it was very arduous, but it certainly prepared you for what you had to face. Okay, then from your primary, then where did you go?
Well, after a month of ground school, we had our first flight instruction.
Okay.
And of course, my first ride in an airplane was my first training flight. I'd never been in an airplane. So that was in those days we had the instructor was like God. You had to carry the parachutes out to the plane and get them in the plane and practically bow to them when they come out.
Right.
But I had a good instructor. He was chief of flight instruction. I remember his name. He was a Marine, Kip, K-I-P-P. Mm-hmm. And he was a good guy. And our first flight, we got up in the air and he went through some maneuvers. And we flew around the area to show where we'd be doing our flying, and then all at once, I told you this story before, he flipped the plane over into a slow roll, and I had forgotten to fasten my seat belt. I started to fall out. I had visions of my Navy career ending right there. So I started grabbing at the sides of the cockpit and anything I could get my hands on. The plane flopped over and back into the seat.
Do you think
So
he knew?
I got my seatbelt fastened in a hurry.
Do you think he knew that you didn't have your seatbelt on?
Oh, no,
He
I
didn't know
no,
that?
I don't think so.
No, he didn't.
So then he said, well, you take the controls and fly us around a little bit. So, so I said, okay.
Sure.
Well, I didn't say okay.
No.
So
Yes,
I
sir.
grabbed the stick. Well, it was obvious that I had never had my hands on the stick of an aircraft before.
Right.
So he said, I got it. And in those days, in that open cockpit plane, they had what they called gosports. The only way you could communicate was the pilot sat in front seat, and he could talk into what they called a gosport, and you were in the back seat. Well, half the time the talk was garbled. What he was saying.
Sure.
And finally, on occasion, they'd say, "Do you hear what I'm saying?" Well, of course you could hear that.
Of course. Speak up, sir.
So
What kind of plane were you?
it was a open cockpit Stearman,
Stearman.
and N3N.
Biplane.
Made by the Navy at that time.
Yeah, yeah.
Most fun plane you could ever imagine. You could do anything in it.
Oh, that was a wonderful
Yeah.
plane, yeah. That was a great plane. Well, how long were you in that primary training?
Well, we were in Minneapolis then most of the summer. I think we left there about mid-August. And by that time, the class of 26 was down to either 18 or 19 of us.
Quite a few washouts.
They called them elimination bases,
Yeah,
and that's truly what they were. That's where they
yeah.
eliminated a lot of the pilots. One of the strange things was that every once in a while there'd be a nice gentleman like yourself would come around and engage me in conversation. I had no idea, who this guy was or what it was all about. Well, I found out later that he was a psychologist.
Oh,
And he was asking questions or trying to determine your mental attitude
Sure.
or where he thought you'd make a
sure.
good pilot down the
You
road.
bet, yeah.
And there were actually a couple of the fellows that were washed out on the basis of that.
Yeah, there were many instances of that. Well, now, we're still talking 1942.
We're still talking 1942.
Boy,
So
yeah.
mid-August of 42, they loaded us on a train and we headed for Corpus Christi, Texas.
Ah,
And that's where I was to finish my program.
sure.
And we got down there and I went through the rest of my primary training, basic training, what they call the Volte vibrator, SNV,
Mm-hmm.
and then into advanced training in a SNJ or AT6. And I was through by January 1st of 43. So
Wow.
I actually graduated January 1st, 43. I was in the program like 7 months when I had my wings.
Mm-hmm.
And an officer and a gentleman.
Absolutely.
And as I used to say on a lot of my talks, I hardly had time to comb the hayseeds out of my hair, and they were calling me an officer and a gentleman.
Well, you had the makings from the beginning, so I don't think there was any problem there.
No, I didn't. I only had one down check, and I was in basic training, and this guy was an idiot.
Uh-huh.
And
Instructor?
yeah, the instructor, and predictably, he did kill himself with a cadet about 2 weeks after I had him for my check ride.
For heaven's sake, how about that? Yeah, there were things like that came as a shock too.
But I should mention a little bit about
Yeah.
the final phase of the training. There were so
Absolutely.
many accidents, as you're probably aware of,
Terrible.
training accidents. Guys flying their planes into the ground or colliding, landing on top of each other. It was incredible the number of people we lost just in training
I
accidents.
know. They
Or you
never
never
got,
got to the
I
point.
know, they never got to finish.
Oh.
Oh, it was terribly sad. Terribly sad. And then there was a period in 43 where the Navy decided, you remember this, the Navy decided there for a while that they had enough pilots,
Oh, yes,
and they washed out so many good guys.
absolutely.
And then later on,
It
hey,
just-
we needed them.
Yeah, it depended on where you were in the program. You know,
That's
some
right.
people, it took them 16 months, 2 years to get through the program, and like you say, they washed a lot of them out at that time.
Sure. Oh, gosh, that was, okay, so now you're, you got your wings, you got your gold stripe, you got your gold bar for your suntans, and you were a brown shoe.
I was a brown shoe, absolutely. So from there, I was given orders to go to Opelika, which is Miami, Florida,
Okay.
where they had a, what they called a pre-operational training base. And there at the pre-operational training base, they had all of the old planes out of the fleet that they no longer wanted or needed, like the old Brewster Buffalo, the
Gee.
bi-wing SB-2C, the old TBD that took such a beating in the Battle of
Devastators.
Midway and other
Yeah.
places. So that's what we flew for a couple months. And that's where I lost my first roommate. He tried to do a split S to a landing from about 1,200 feet and went right straight into the
Oh,
ground.
goodness sakes.
So that was my first roommate I lost.
Right.
And so after, let's see, I guess I was there 2 months. And then we were ordered up to Jacksonville, Florida for operational training. That's where I first began to fly the Grumman Avenger, the TBF. And that was quite a plane, 16 feet up to the cockpit.
I know.
And how I ever managed to get up on that wing and get up there to the cockpit, I don't know, but I did. I was young.
Well, that was a big buster for a single engine
Yeah, it
plane.
was. In World War II, it was the largest single engine plane on the carrier.
Isn't that something?
Right.
Yeah.
So I was in Jacksonville. While I was in Jacksonville, I got that so-called horrible disease a lot of people got called cat fever. I don't know what I still don't know what it is or what it was, but it was a low-grade kind of temperature thing. So I got held back for a couple weeks. I spent all my time around the swimming pool and not doing a lousy thing, checking in with the doctor once a day, and it just drove me nuts because I wanted to get out of there.
Of course.
And after a couple weeks, I went in one day and the doctor said, I guess they thought I was not wanting to go or something. He said, we're discharging you. And I said, great, I'm ready to go.
What have you been waiting for?
Yeah. So from there, I went home. They sent me home for a little leave. And from there to Glenview Naval Air Station in Chicago for my first carrier checkouts.
Now that was something on the
That
Great
was-
Lakes,
that was
wasn't
it.
it?
That was something. There were two little carriers there, converted passenger ships. One was called the Wolverine, one the Sable. And I had to check out on the Wolverine. We had to have 8 landings. You fly out and make your 8 landings. If you're successful, you go back and you're ready to move on. And I didn't have any trouble. I must say that first carrier landing was probably about the most exciting thing I ever did in the Navy. After I landed, I sat in the cockpit and I could do it.
Now, what were you flying?
The Grumman Avenger.
You were flying the Avenger.
Yeah. Mhm.
So right from the get-go,
Right.
you were right into the Avengers
Yeah.
and away.
Right.
Now tell us about that Avenger. That's a great plane.
Well, like I said, it was the largest single-engine aircraft. It had a Wright Cyclone engine, about 1,850 horsepower. It carried 2,000-pound load, either a 2,000-pound torpedo or 2,000 pounds of bombs of one sort or another. And we carried 8 rockets, 4 under each wing.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a turret gunner behind the pilot with a 50 caliber gun, and down in the belly where the radio man sat, there was another little pea shooter down there, 30 caliber. So that was the armament. Top speed cruising was about 175 knots. We usually made our attacks from about 12 to 14,000 feet. And since we had no dive brakes, we had to do what we called glide bombing. We couldn't go at more than a 45-degree angle or you'd tear off the wing or the tail.
Wow.
We had to be careful of that. But we could build up quite a bit of speed even at a 45-degree angle from 14,000 feet.
Sure.
It was a rugged plane. It was very, very rugged. I've seen some come back from combat hops that had half the tail missing or big holes in the wings.
Right.
Really shot up to the point where they just threw it overboard.
Right.
Yeah, it was a rugged plane.
Well, Grumman did a great job with all their planes.
Yes, they did.
Heavily armored, and that was one of the great things. We had the advantage over the Japanese out
They're
there.
Hellcats and
Yeah.
Wildcats.
Oh boy. Yes, I should say. Well, and also, you know, for people that don't remember, that was the same kind of plane that
George Bush.
President 41,
Yes.
flew as a 19-year-old.
Right.
How about that? Okay, now, you made your landings, you qualified for carrier. Of course, you were on the Great Lakes, and the water was a little calmer there.
A little bit.
So, from where then?
Well, then I received orders to join a squadron, an air group, and it happened to be Air Group 2. They sent me to Atlantic City. I got there, and of course the squadron wasn't there. It had moved on up to Quonset Point, Rhode Island, and that's where I joined my squadron then that I'd be a part of for the next year and a half or whatever.
How about that?
And we trained at Quonset Point. The rest of the air group, the dive bombers, trained at a base in New Jersey, and the fighter squadron trained at Atlantic City. And eventually we did get together. But
How many in the air group?
the large carriers, the Essex class carriers, like I was on, carried about 90 planes.
Wow.
And there were at least 35 to 50 pilots in the dive bombers and fighters. Torpedo bombers, I think we had around 26 to 30. So it was a large air group, and originally we were designated a night outfit.
Oh.
We were supposed to be a night outfit, and all our training the first couple of months at Quonset Point was at night, field carrier landing practice, all our bombing missions, everything. And just before we left Quonset Point, they changed us back to a day squadron.
How about that?
So after we finished we were there all that summer, and incidentally, at station there at that time was Henry Fonda.
Really?
I never did really talk to him, but going in and out of the wardroom for your meals, he was always there. I'd see him around. So he was in the Navy there.
He was a pilot?
No.
He was not a
No,
pilot.
I don't know what his job
Deck
was.
officer.
Some kind.
Right.
So then let's see, it was in November, we were given orders to fly to the West Coast to pick up another transportation to Hawaii. So we flew our planes across the country, making landings at Shreveport, Midland, Texas, and different places till we hit the West Coast. And we lost quite a few planes. Our very first stop, one of the pilots landed with his wheels up. And there were a lot of incidents, including myself. When I was flying over Texas, the cockpit filled with smoke. And of course, I had no idea. I thought the plane was on fire, so I immediately started looking around. It was out in the middle of nowhere in Texas, and finally I did see a little sand airstrip. So I went down and landed on this little sand airstrip, and my crew were able to determine that it was a generator fire. Generator had burned out. So we got back. In the meantime, a couple of farmers had driven up in an old beat-up pickup truck, and they were curious. And
Sure.
and the sand on that runway was such that it was very difficult. They had to give me a push on the wings to get me started.
Oh, for gosh sake.
The sand was that deep, and then at the end of this little runway was a fence to keep the stock out.
Gee whiz.
So as I approached this fence, I still was on the ground. So I popped the flaps and I jumped over the fence and staggered into the air, and we got away with it. But anyway, I flew on to Midland, Texas, where there was a big Army air base, and landed there. And the engine was all full of sand, and so I had to wait there 2 weeks till they sent a new engine out from San Diego.
For goodness sakes.
And I finally got out to the coast one day before we got aboard the ship to go to Hawaii. Almost missed my ride. So then this was on the USS Cabot, which you're familiar with, Ted.
Sure, the light carrier.
CPL light carrier. That was our transportation to Hawaii because we still had not been assigned a carrier.
Oh.
And we got out to Hawaii, and we went first to Ford Island, and from there we went to Kaneohe Bay for training, and from Kaneohe Bay over to Hilo. We were there, I don't know, about a month at least, so it was really early March before they determined that we would be assigned to the carrier Hornet.
Now, when you were there in Hawaii, and of course that must have been pretty exciting for you to get to those beautiful islands. And,
Absolutely.
But what was your duty there? You're flying out over the ocean?
We were doing...
On patrol?
We were doing anti-submarine patrol. We'd go out on missions and come back in and attack the islands. And we did a lot of work at Hilo with the Marines on close air support. They were training on the big island of Hilo, Hawaii.
Right.
And so it was that kind of thing.
Yeah,
We did navigation.
Yeah.
Different aspects that we need to keep ourselves sharp.
Sure, absolutely. And that was the important thing. And you had to have fixed in your mind what you had to do and what it was up to you to do, and to maintain the overall plan. And that was so important. And I think there were some people that really didn't get that message fully.
Well, that's true.
And many of them, as you point out, weren't able to finish up because they...
We had some accidents there. You know, in line with what you're saying, we did have one pilot. The closer we came to going on a carrier for combat, the more nervous he got. And finally, at the end, he would go to the end of the runway for takeoff, and he couldn't push the throttle forward.
Couldn't do it.
So of course they had to send him back to the States.
Right.
And we did lose a pilot in Hawaii on a pre-dawn takeoff. He made a turn to the port instead of the starboard and ran into a mountain.
Good heavens.
And he was killed. The two crewmen survived because he kind of pancaked into the mountain. And this is interesting in line with what you're saying. The one crewman, he was just a total nervous wreck, and they had to send him back to the States. And the other crewman, he was flying the next day.
How about that? Yeah.
Guy by the name of Murphy. Maybe it's because he was Irish.
Good old Irish spirit, isn't that something? Yeah, well, that was the thing, as we all understand. The personalities involved and the mental states and so forth. Okay, so now you finally got your assignment?
Finally got assignment to the Hornet, the Air Group 15, which later in the war turned out to be one of the top squadrons I can't think of the guy's name now, the air group commander that got 35 planes.
Oh, McConnell?
McConnell, yeah.
Yeah.
He was part of that Air Group 15, but they had so many accidents coming out, flying practice missions and so on, that the captain said, I'm not going to keep this air group aboard.
Is that so?
So they were taken off the carrier, and that gave our Air Group 2, the air group I was a part of, a chance to get on the carrier. So about March 15th, the carrier left Pearl Harbor, and we flew our planes aboard, and we were on our way.
How about that?
So
And you were on your way
we
to,
were on our way to the Pacific, out to the war zone,
out to the far, far reaches.
where we'd be for the next 7 months.
Now, your base out there, or your area was in the, what, in the Gilberts or the Carolines, or?
Well, we went all the way, we went as far south as New Guinea.
Mm-hmm.
That was the further south we got on any of the missions. And as far west as the Philippines, Palau Islands, and as far north as the Bonin Islands.
Right.
And we were everything in between.
Yeah, you know, James Bradley's book, Flyboys,
Yes.
concentrated on that up
That area.
in the Bonins
Yeah,
particularly. and
our carrier happened to go up there. We were up there 4 different times
really?
while I was on the Hornet. It seemed like we were just up there all the time. They would break our carrier off and one other to go up, and they had that large communications station up there on Chichijima,
Oh, yeah.
and they would send signals out to all over the Pacific to their various bases. So we were always trying to knock that thing out along with some of the air
Sure.
bases. And that's where, of course, George Bush got shot down.
Yes.
We were up there on that very same time that happened.
Right, right. Tell us about some of the personalities aboard the Hornet.
Well, my skipper, a guy by the name of Jack Arnold, who later became a 4-star admiral, still living incidentally. He's
Is he?
93 years old now, lives out in the San Diego area.
Wow.
I always admired him because I was his wingman. He made me his wingman.
How about that? That's an honor.
Yeah, it was. So I guess he wanted to protect this little farm boy from Iowa, take him under his wing or something.
I think he realized that farm boy from Iowa was what he needed to be his wingman.
So
Well, isn't that-
he was a academy graduate.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't have too many in the squadron. As a matter of fact, as it ended up when we were finally out in the Pacific, he was the only academy graduate we had in our squadron.
Really?
The air group commander, Roy Johnson, also made 4-star admiral, and he was the admiral in charge of the Pacific Fleet at the Gulf of Tonkin
Oh, yes.
incident at that time.
Oh.
And he just died a few years ago.
Uh-huh.
Great guy.
Right.
I knew both these men very, very well. And of course, the biggest character of all, and the real leader, was our admiral, that was Jocko Clark, that had his flag on our ship. And he was a true gangbuster from the word go in terms of going after the Japanese.
Right.
He was another Bull Halsey.
Right. Well, fortunately, he didn't make quite the big mistakes in Halsey.
No, but in my squadron we had people. We had a graduate from Princeton. We had a graduate from Yale. There were graduates from all over. We had one person in the squadron that had in fact gone to pre-flight, so his nickname was Pre-Flight. So we had just different people of all different kinds of professions.
Sure. Now, your squadron leader was a flyer, wasn't he?
Oh, yes.
He went.
Yeah.
He led the squadron off the carrier out to the enemy.
Yeah. Well, yeah, on certain flights there would be other flight leaders as well.
Right.
obviously we didn't take all the planes on one flight. We usually flew anywhere from 9 to 12 planes in a flight.
I see.
And then there would be other flights to follow. We were being with the skipper's particular unit, we were always first ones off in the morning generally,
Oh, yeah.
which would be like, we called them pre-dawn flights, where it was, we'd take off before daylight.
0500.
The object of it was to be over the target at daylight. Well, as it turned out, it was just a huge mess, because you can imagine planes, half the time the carrier would be hiding under a cloud, and it would be raining when we took off, no ceiling, and you'd get up there circling around trying to find your other airplanes, and you'd hit slipstreams, and you know, it was scarier than the combat itself. So,
Did you ever spot an enemy sub?
I never saw an enemy sub, no, no, I never did. But,
Well, now the Hornet, of course, and you have that, Ken has this wonderful, wonderful scorecard framed. I mean, that is a piece of history that's unparalleled. And tell us about what the Hornet came up with
well,
in the way of kills.
it had
and
a
stuff.
tremendous record. The Hornet was actually out there 14 months, and it did not finish the war, unfortunately, because in June of 45, we hit that tremendous typhoon, and the deck was torn up.
Oh my gosh.
And even after the front of the deck was rolled up, Clark even then he was determined he was not going to go back.
Right.
So they launched some planes off the stern.
Really?
Yeah. So, but it didn't turn out very well. They lost a course there. So they finally were ordered back to the States, and so they missed the end of the war. But the Hornet in 14 months never got hit by an enemy aircraft or a kamikaze. Came close many, many times. But so they were called the Lucky Hornet.
Mm-hmm.
Unlike the Intrepid in New York that got hit time and time and time again. There were some carriers just unlucky that way.
Right.
But our record was just unbelievable. They shot down 668 planes in 14 months, the three fighter groups. And had a total of 1,400, including planes shot up on the ground. There wasn't a carrier out there that had a better record as far as that in that time span.
Right.
There are records that the Hornet holds will never be broken because of the changing nature of warfare. Now you don't have dogfights and so on, but we had more aces in a day than any carrier there'll ever be. We had the most planes shot down in a day, the most planes shot down in a week, the most planes shot down in a month, and
Just
on
amazing.
and on and on. But it wasn't all fighter pilots.
No.
We also sank the dive bombers and torpedo bomber planes, sank over 1 million tons of shipping, including one carrier, Japanese carrier, a couple of cruisers, about 14 destroyers, and a lot of merchant shipping. So it was a record, and this was all imposed on this large scoreboard that you refer to that was on the island structure of the carrier. And after the war, that scoreboard was taken to the Naval Air Museum in Pensacola, where it's the only scoreboard there that I'm aware of that's on display in the museum
actual
down there. The actual
piece.
Scoreboard, yes.
Isn't that something?
So,
What became of the Hornet? Did they
the Hornet,
scrap it?
after it remained on active duty until 1970,
Really?
during that period of time, it was in Korea and
Yeah.
Vietnam. Never really played that big a part like World War II. And it's one of its final great missions was the Apollo 11 and 12, the first two lunar missions, where Neil Armstrong was the first man on the moon. The Hornet was the recovery ship for both of those first two lunar missions. And in 1970, she was put in mothballs out in Bremerton, Washington, where she remained until they finally, the Japanese wanted to buy it for scrap iron. That was, didn't do that, but then there was a company finally bought it to scrap it. But in the meantime, there was efforts mounted to save the ship.
Yeah.
And ultimately it was saved, and it is now a museum at Alameda Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area.
That's so interesting. I'm glad you brought that up because it's important for the public to know and to be able to go and see a heroic ship that did so much. And actually go aboard it and look around.
Unfortunately, excuse me, Ted.
Sure, go ahead.
Unfortunately, it's not in a very good location as far as people being able to get there to see it. If it were in San Francisco, it'd be a lot better.
Yeah.
As far as having visitors, they get a lot of visitors, don't misunderstand me. But it's not like the Intrepid in New York or the Yorktown in Charleston or the Lexington and Corpus Christi.
Well, unfortunately, we know that San Francisco's got some serious
problems.
Some serious problems, and they, well, I guess we better not go into that now, but what we want to know more about, tell us about some of these sorties that you went out on.
Well,
you've talked about, the no ceiling and the terrible weather and trying to rendezvous and so forth.
Yeah, I can go through a few of the missions I went on, I guess.
That's what we need.
One of the, on the way out to our first mission to Palau, somebody had to deliver a message to a Marine base on Green Island, which was about 600 miles south of our track going out towards Palau, and I was selected to deliver that message.
The message to Green.
So I had to find this little island, all by dead reckoning.
Sure.
You have a plotting board. People that aren't familiar, you have a plotting board on your lap, and you draw some lines on there, and that's the way you navigate. According to the direction of the wind, the speed of the wind, your direction of flight, and so on.
And you pray that you're right.
So I flew down. This is the first long over water flight I'd ever had, of course.
Wow.
And I did find the little island.
Good for you.
Landed right there, a little airstrip in the middle of the jungle. It was a Marine air base. And after I landed, I saw all these Corsairs hidden under the trees and bushes, and delivered the message, gassed up, and started back. And I found my way back to the carrier. It was right at dark when I got back. So that gave me a lot of confidence. I knew I could navigate after that.
Absolutely.
So then we went on to Palau, and for a day or two before we got there, we were harassed by Japanese planes. They knew we were coming.
They were flying out of where?
They were flying out of Palau.
Oh, they were?
Yes.
We hadn't conquered Palau yet.
Before we got there. And
wow.
Then on the very first day that we were to fly missions, our mission was to drop some aerial mines into the harbor. We wanted to tie up their harbor for as long as we could, so their ships couldn't get in and out of there. To do that, we had to go in and down to like 200 feet and 150 knots to drop our mine. So on the very first flight, the skipper naturally had that flight, and I was on his wing. We were up about 4 o'clock in the morning. Like I said before, we planned out our flight, and all at once they said, "All right, pilots, man your planes." Our ready room was right under the deck on the port side, so it was only a few steps up onto the flight deck. You get up on the deck, it was raining, it was dark. The planes, you don't know where your plane is, so your plane captain has to put a flashlight on the tail where the number is, so you know where your plane is. So you run to your plane, and about 30 seconds later, pilots start your engines. And that's really something, Ted, as you know, being on a carrier yourself. All these big old props spinning in the dark. Extremely hazardous kind of a situation for the deck.
Yeah, there were unfortunate accidents
Yes.
on the deck.
So shortly after our planes are revved up, they start launching planes. The fighters always went first. They had more power, so they didn't need as much flight deck. The torpedo bombers would go second, and the dive bombers last. And we got up in position to take off, and when you stand on your brakes, rev your engine to full power, and the guys there finally points the flag down the deck, and away you go.
Right.
Hope you make it.
Right, right.
On that very first mission, one of our pilots hit the island structure.
Oh, gosh.
I don't know, his name was Greek Barriolas. He played tackle for Notre Dame before the war. And he always had a problem with his vision. I can't think of the term now. Well, anyway, he should never probably been flying. So that crew was killed right away.
Oh, my goodness.
And we got up, and like I said, before the ceiling was low, we're grouping around up there, and we finally got together, and we headed off into the target. And at that time, yet there were still quite a few Japanese Zeros around, so we were harassed by the Zeros all the way in. We played hide and seek with them in the clouds going in.
Right.
When we got to the target, we had to dive our planes right down between two big hills on each side, and of course the anti-aircraft fire was zeroed in on us as we made our approach into the harbor. And we got in there and dropped our mines, and we did get out. We did lose 2 planes in that first flight. So we lost quite a few planes and people that very first mission, but I guess it was worth it because we did mine the harbor and put it out of commission for a while.
Right. Well, that Palau campaign was a terrible thing. It was desperate. The Marines on shore and everything.
So we got back to the carrier, and we had a couple other flights into there, and it was on the second mission actually where I went in the water on takeoff and was picked up with the destroyer Monahan. And due to the bad weather that developed, I couldn't get back aboard the carrier for a couple of weeks, which was
really
miserable for me because I was seasick every day. Matter of fact, I slept out. They had their potato bin was outside on the deck outside, and I slept in the potato bin for 2 weeks.
How frustrating was that? Oh my goodness, I should say. But you were lucky.
I was lucky.
You sure were.
That ship, the Monahan, went down in a typhoon later in the war, along with 2 others.
Yeah, December '44.
So that was one mission. I could talk about all the missions, but another bad one was over Truk, which was the Pearl Harbor of the Japanese fleet at that time. And that day we went into Truk. It was another cloud cover over the islands, and there was one little hole in the cloud, and all the planes started diving through the hole in the cloud.
All the same
of course,
time.
pretty soon the anti-aircraft fire was there waiting to greet them.
Oh, sure.
And as I went in, I found my target and laid my bombs down on some shipping right there at the docks. And as I pulled up and looked around, 6 of our planes were on fire. And that was the very raid where the submarine Tang,
Oh, yes.
they act as a guard outside were the target areas were to pick up down pilots. They picked up 26 of our people on that very raid.
Marvelous.
And they had so many pilots and crewmen on the board the sub that they couldn't get them all down inside, so they had to stand around out on the outside of the submarine. They finally towed them out where a destroyer could come and take them off the sub.
Good heavens.
So truck was always rough.
Yeah.
And as you know, they decided to bypass truck as one way.
Yes,
They decided to
yes.
bypass.
Yeah, and that's interesting what you bring up, Ken. There were several similar situations that, in retrospect, we could have bypassed.
Yes.
Well, now here's the old Hornet, and finally you got your orders to head back to the States.
In early September, we were supposed to go back, but then they decided that they would keep us aboard for the first attacks on the Philippine Islands.
Okay.
And that was in late September.
Yes.
And the last 6 missions that I flew were over the Philippines.
All the
And
Philippines.
some of those were extremely long flights.
Oh yeah.
Because to have the carrier out in the ocean to get to Manila was
Yeah.
quite a distance.
Sure. And
So,
and of course that the Philippines was still heavily defended.
yeah, it was.
Well, unfortunately, we're running out of time here. I want to find out, at last you got back to your states, got back to the States. You met your wife to be, got married afterwards, or were you married before you went in?
No. We didn't get married until 1950.
Okay,
So
all right.
it was a ways after
Sure.
while after the war.
And then did you immediately go to Miami University as a teacher?
When the war was over, first of all, I decided to go regular Navy. Before my second tour out there was as executive officer of a carrier replacement squadron at Barbers Point, Hawaii.
Okay.
And at that time, I decided to go regular Navy. I'll try to make this fast. And I came back to the States and was sent to Chicoutimi, Virginia, where I was assigned to a civilian team that was developing this White Sands missile stuff. And I was to be a test pilot to fly that.
Oh, good.
Well, after I was there a couple of months, I was getting a little pressure from home, and I finally decided to get out.
Yeah.
Went back to Iowa, and for a while I worked in the Soil Conservation Service, and then I finally ended up taking a 2-week cruise down in Olathe, Kansas, and it was there they wanted me to come back into the Navy, and I said no, I'm going to move to Detroit to start school at Wayne State University.
Okay.
And it was there I got in the reserve, stayed in for 30 years.
Right.
And that's where I met my wife.
Oh gosh, well that's wonderful. Was she a Michigander?
She was a Detroit
How
lady,
about
and we ended up with 5 sons. They're all graduates of Miami University.
Oh,
They're all doing great.
isn't
And,
that great?
Rose and I were Miami Parents of the Year in 1985.
Sure, and you're in the Ohio,
I'm in the Ohio
Veterans Hall of Fame.
I am.
That's wonderful. That's just
A few other little honors along the way.
well, I'm
but
sure, and I wish
It's been a great life.
Yeah, well, you've made such a tremendous contribution as a citizen and a community leader and a teacher and everything. And Ken, I can't thank you enough for having the opportunity to talk to you. And maybe someday we'll get another tape and we'll hear more about your wonderful life. God bless. Thank you.
Thank you, Ted.
And
I
congratulations.
appreciate the opportunity.
Well, it's just been wonderful. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.